This talk really has nothing to do with colorectal surgery, but everything to do with colorectal surgery at the same time. We're going to be covering the history of money and the future of money as it pertains to healthcare funding. So some of these discussions are going to be slightly outside of our usual comfort zones, so get comfortable, strap in. It's going to be a bit of a bumpy ride for everyone. But we'll start with the familiar. One of the reasons we love conferences like this is because, we get to see the coolest tech and the latest advances in the delivery of treatment for colorectal disease. Everything from, the latest generation of robots, which you can see outside in the foyer, to targeted molecular therapies and everything in between. And it's fair to say that the future for the treatment of colorectal disease is really very exciting. We're sort of on the precipice of a lot of new discoveries. But after the conference is done and we all head back home tomorrow, back to our jobs, the truth is that we face a very, very different reality. The reality we'll face tomorrow when we go back to work is not one of resource abundance. We face a reality of resource scarcity. The harsh truth is that we can no longer afford to pay for most of this stuff, and certainly not for the healthcare gold standard that we wish to deliver for our patients. And the other truth is that this is probably a bigger problem than anything else we face. It's certainly a bigger problem now than, how big your incision is for your extraction site. Soon it won't be about which robot you've got, but whether you can use it at all, because there's not enough beds in your hospital. And we all feel this pressure at the coalface every single day. These two headlines are from this year, from 2 different continents. I'm also going to go out on a limb and say that our elected representatives cannot fix this problem. Not because they don't want to, but because their frame of reference and their incentives are both somewhat misplaced to address this issue. In fact, as is often the way these days, most of our health ministers, and these are a selection of some of our health ministers, seem to have the same opinions and the same talking points about these sorts of issues. They say things like, it's an unfixable situation, healthcare is an infinite money pit. The growing and aging population, certainly in Western countries, is unsustainable. We will never be able to afford it. And their solutions are not really solutions. Their solutions are more about austerity. So, tax more, but from our end, reduce the amount of healthcare we deliver. We need to work harder and smarter. And basically, we need to face reality. We can't keep doing everything we want to do. But I'm here to tell you that you should not believe this rhetoric. And I will make my case as to why. This is probably the best meme you can put in a colorectal talk, so I always try and sneak it in somewhere. So today we will discuss healthcare funding. I'll try and keep it a bit interesting. We'll talk about how it works and where these systems are failing or have completely failed. And I'll be making the case that the solution to this problem is not going to come from politicians, it's not going to come from strikes or protests, and it's not going to come from philanthropy. The solution is going to come from technology, the same type of technology that brought us robots, AI, and targeted therapies. At its basic level, healthcare funding is not complicated, despite what the politicians would have you believe. There's 2 basic models, which most of us understand quite well. The public model, where taxpayers pay some money and the government allocates funding to public hospitals, and a private model, where the user pays for their healthcare, either directly or through insurance, and the insurance administers the funds to private hospitals to deliver care. Most of our countries have a balance of these 2 systems. We're a little bit lucky in Australia in that it's fairly well balanced between the 2 sectors, and that affords us certain privileges. But more importantly, both of these models should be self-sustaining, and they should be infinitely scalable. Because the more the population grows or the more users you have, the more funding you should have. Unless, that is, there is a leak somewhere in the system that is resulting in the funding not translating into the outcomes that we want. And I'll use an example close to home to illustrate how this leak might work. So this is my home hospital. This is the original version of it, which was built in 1840. At that time, it cost £8,000 to build, and it had 30 beds for a population of 10,000 people. So the ratio of beds to population was about 1 in 300. Fast forward a few years, Adelaide's growing, so the hospital expanded. At an amazing cost of £50,000, they managed to secure 200 beds in total for a population of 100,000 people. But you'll notice the bed ratio dropped a little bit, from 1 in 300 to 1 in 500. Fast forward to 1967, this is the hospital I actually started working in. This was a sort of sequential hodgepodge of buildings that were added on over time, but the total cost to bring it to the final version was $100 million. This hospital was quite large at 900 beds for a population then of 600,000 people in 1967, with a bed ratio of 1 in 800. And now for the new hospital, which was completed in 2019. This hospital was built at a staggering cost of $2.4 billion. At its time, it was the third most expensive building of any kind ever built by our species. Somewhat amazingly, however, it dropped from 900 beds to 800 beds, despite the incremental cost. And the population of Adelaide now is much larger, and the bed ratio of the Royal Adelaide to the population of Adelaide is 1 in 2,000. And this is echoed throughout the Western world. And I guess the question is, why is this happening? You know, what's broken? What's failing? Why do we keep getting less beds despite spending more money? Does it really have anything to do with the aging population or us not working hard enough? It doesn't really add up. You know, it doesn't make sense that that would be the reason. And I think intuitively we all know the reason. We just don't tend to think about it very much in the context of healthcare. It turns out that across the Western world and globally, we share another systemic problem, and that is that the purchasing power of our money is disappearing. If you look at the reserve currency, which is the US dollar, over the last 50 years, it's lost about 95% of its purchasing value. Some would say up to 99% of its purchasing value. And in the context of healthcare, we would call this hyperinflation. And it's a problem that dwarfs any other problem that we face today. And it's something that we need to start thinking more about, I think. So the reason we feel this more acutely in healthcare, even though we don't actively think about it, is because inflation is not created equal across every sector. We happen to work in a situation where we deliver an essential service, which is healthcare. And essential goods and services inflate much faster because the demand for our services is inelastic regardless of the price. So for example, if you have to see a doctor because your leg's falling off, you can't delay that. You have to see the doctor regardless of the price that it costs to see the doctor. Unlike, say, buying an iPhone or a TV, where you can delay the purchase if required, if the price is too high, or you can choose an alternative. You know, you have options there, but not so much for essential services. It's the same issue we see with the housing crisis, really. This chart demonstrates this very well. So CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, generally relates to things like food and beverages and housing. And you get constant headlines about this, you know, the housing crisis, the food crisis. But look right up the top is hospital services, which is by far the fastest inflating, hyperinflating service that we have in our society. Most estimates would put the inflation in healthcare costs at about 10% increase every year, which is very high. Now, this is a graph of what my government spends on healthcare across all sectors, and it goes up about 3% per year. And what's amazing, just like the slide I showed before with the politicians across every country, this is pretty much the same in every country, because they peg healthcare funding to CPI. In other words, they spend 3% more a year, and I'll bet if you check the NHS or here in France or in the US, you will find very similar figures to this. So what happens when you get a 3% raise, but the thing you're trying to buy costs 10% more? I didn't actually edit this meme. I stole it directly off Twitter, and it just happened to have the right numbers. Well, what you get is this. You get fewer beds, because the beds you're trying to buy are getting more expensive, and you're not spending enough. This is probably the most important chart you'll see today, so please, if you've fallen asleep already, please wake yourself up and have a bit of a focus on this. This chart tracks the number of hospital beds per person in Australia over 65, and it shows that this has gone down pretty much every single year for 30 years straight. This is across the whole country. It's kind of surprising, isn't it? Because you wouldn't think this would be the case. And again, this chart looks exactly the same in every Western country. It's a global phenomenon underpinned by currency hyperinflation as it relates to healthcare spending. And as long as this is the case, we will continue to go backwards every year, and the robots will continue to be less and less useful every year. Fewer beds means fewer operations, and it's just as simple as that. And so you'll keep getting headlines like this every day. So now that we've more clearly sort of defined the problem as being related to healthcare price inflation, is there any hope that we can fix this problem? Well, if you had a quiet chat with these lovely people over here, they would say, not really. You're stuffed. Sorry. And to be fair to them, this is based on two kind of rational assumptions, at least from their perspective. One is that the dollar will keep inflating forever, and the other is that there's no solution. Those are two slightly different statements. And in fact, I agree with the first statement, or the first assumption. The dollar will keep inflating forever, and I'll describe why this is. But I believe that the second one is grossly incorrect, and I will make the case for that as well. So let's unpack these two statements. Dollar inflation is perpetual. This is correct. But to understand why this is correct, we need to understand how we got here in the first place. And there's some particular relevance to where we're sitting right now in the middle of Paris. To understand how the money broke, we need to understand how the money we use was invented. The money we know today really began in its current form in 1944, towards the end of World War II, in what was known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. This pegged the US dollar to gold, and it pegged all other currencies directly or indirectly to the US dollar, establishing a new global world reserve currency to serve as the backbone of the new global economy. That lasted 20 years, and then something broke. This is Charles de Gaulle, who the Paris airport is named after. In 1965, he was considered a legendary figure in French politics. He raised a public alarm via an international speech at the United Nations, saying that the US dollar was no longer being backed by gold, and that the American central banks were printing fake dollars and not supporting that with purchases of gold. He asked for 5 years pretty much straight that the global community go back to a gold standard, because otherwise we would risk global hyperinflation. And after 5 years, his requests were ignored and denied. He actually sent naval warships from Paris to New York to pick up the French gold and give back the US dollar reserves they were hanging on to. We don't hear about this much these days, but at the time it was a pretty drastic thing to do. Even more importantly, when the bluff was called and Charles de Gaulle was proven correct, Richard Nixon decided to completely and publicly sever any connection between the US dollar and gold in what was called as a Nixon shock in 1971. This was meant to be a temporary emergency measure. We've heard that many times over the last few years, but this was never reversed. So today, and ever since 1971, the money printing of our global reserve currency has gone absolutely bananas. It's almost unbelievable. In fact, there's an entire website dedicated to this. It's called WTFhappenedin1971.com. I encourage you to all go look at it. It's full of charts of just really depressing things that have gone off the rails since 1971. Even things like global wars and all sorts of other stuff. So please check it out. So I guess the question then is, why don't we just stop doing this? It's obviously screwing us over big time, especially when it comes to healthcare. Why don't we just stop printing money and go back to a gold standard? Unfortunately, that's not possible. And the reason it's not possible is because we're in so much debt as a species across the globe that this is no longer reversible. This chart shows different countries. Sorry, the writing's a bit small, but it shows how much debt different countries are into, and this is a few years old now. What's interesting about this is that every country's in debt, even the ones in green. It's just that the ones in green are doing slightly better. So the global debt today is around about $70+ trillion, and every single country is in debt. Now the question is, if every country is in debt, then who are we in debt to? Who's lending this money? And the truth about this is relatively obscured, but in fact quite deliberately obscured, using vague terms like quantitative easing and government bonds and blah, blah, blah. But it turns out that our governments are just borrowing from each other, using their own future purchasing power as collateral by issuing government debt with a promise to pay this back down the road. So it's kind of like a bit of a merry-go-round. You lend me money, I'll pay it back later, and I'll lend you money and you pay it back later. Basically, every government is doing this across the globe, and they're all printing money to finance it. It's basically just a giant global Ponzi scheme at this point. And unfortunately, we're at the point now where the total debt worldwide is over 200% of global GDP, right? So it's double how much money we can make. And successive governments really do nothing but kick the can down the road and basically putting us in a permanent debt spiral. So this is not going to get fixed, and I think we just need to come to grips with that. Some might say that the central banks do have a choice. Why don't we just default on the debt? Because that would create worldwide panic and a global depression, and because they're only elected for a few short years, when faced with the choice of creating that panic or printing, they will print, and they will print every single time. It's also vital to understand that this is a bipartisan phenomenon. It's international, but even within your country, regardless of which country you're in or which flavor of government you might have, red or blue or whatever color or pink, they continue to print money with every generation. And you can't vote your way out of this. And the result is the slow but definite destruction of the currency. So we just need to get used to this. So at this point, I have to apologize because I think I've made you all very depressed and gloomy about our future, so sorry about that. But we still have yet to address the second assumption, and this is where some of us have a fundamental disagreement with the political class. See, unlike them, we can see a world where technology and innovation quite literally can fix this. To be honest, though, it's not the politicians' fault. They can't see what we see. The incumbents always miss disruption, particularly when it comes to technology, that's about to whip the carpet out from under them. The post office never saw Gmail coming. Record companies, music companies, they never saw Spotify coming. Physical retail shops, they never saw Amazon coming. Blockbuster Video never saw Netflix coming. They all had to readjust after the fact. And the same thing is going to be true for money. This headline is from the year 2000. I remember the year 2000. So even in the year 2000, many commentators thought the internet was just a passing fad and that it would just come and go and it wasn't that important. And I put it to you that we are at this point. We're on the precipice of another major tech disruption. And this tech disruption is going to be of money itself. This is the solution, in my opinion. The Bitcoin white paper was published in 2009. In it is outlined a breakthrough invention by a group of coders and economists that were just fed up with the GFC and how the banks were bailed out using taxpayer money, but actually decided to do something about it and proposed a technological solution to this problem. What they invented after many years of work was a global, electronic, unconfiscatable, and perhaps most importantly, unprintable monetary standard for the 21st century. So how did they do this? I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the properties of good money are well understood. It's just that we haven't had the technology to fulfill these properties. We've just had kind of surrogates. So gold kind of fulfilled some of the promises in that it was scarce and incorruptible. We needed cash because we couldn't walk around with bars of gold, so that kind of fulfilled some of those promises. But we didn't really have anything that could tick all the boxes. And what the Satoshi team basically accomplished is that they systematically and definitively addressed all of these properties using a digital token. Now, how exactly they did this is beyond the scope of this talk, because it would take about another hour to fully explain that. But suffice to say, it is considered a paradigm shift in computer science research and increasingly in economics as well. And to be really frank with you guys, it doesn't really matter how it works, right? Just like it doesn't really matter how the internet works. We just use it, right? It doesn't matter how the robot works. Like the inner workings of the electronics of the robot don't matter. We just know that we like to use it. And also importantly, it's important that if it's being adopted or not. The rate of adoption of Bitcoin as a monetary standard is around about the rate of the adoption of the internet at this stage in its life. This is probably the largest survey we have, published earlier this year, of 3,500 random US citizens. And it shows that adoption is skyrocketing. About 1 in 5 Americans today own Bitcoin in one form or another. And I think it cements the idea that, like the internet, this is not just a passing fad. This is something to be considered seriously. There are also now hundreds of public companies around the world using this technology to preserve their wealth and purchasing power in their treasuries. And they're basically switching from government bonds, which they've lost faith in, to Bitcoin for their long-term wealth preservation and savings. In the past 12 months, Wall Street fund managers have also started getting in on the action, including the biggest one of all, BlackRock, which is the single largest wealth manager in the world. And countries are soon to follow, likely in the next year or two. So watch out for those headlines. I guess what I'm trying to convince you of is it's really starting to feel like there is a new neutral reserve monetary standard which is about to take hold, and it's very exciting to watch, even though it might be a bit scary because we're not used to this idea of changing money over. But you still might ask, like, how does this affect healthcare? Like, it's still going to be expensive to deliver healthcare. So how does sound money fix healthcare spending? Well, there are many ways, actually, that this would work, but there are two of particular importance that I will focus on today. The first is more accurate measurement of inflation, and the second is better resource allocation. We already talked about how the governments currently spend 3% per year on healthcare, pretending as though that is the inflation measurement for healthcare. But obviously, that's totally inappropriate. Healthcare inflation is much higher than CPI, and I think on a Bitcoin standard, this will become much more obvious, because the ruler with which we measure inflation in is fixed at that point. It is not manipulated by variable rates of money printing. And so I think we have a hope of wanting to spend, say, 10% more on healthcare if it's required, and maybe spending less on other things that we don't care as much about, like international wars and various other things. There's another sort of leak in the system which sound money addresses, which is something called the Cantillon effect. When you have a money printer, which we have had since the 1970s, the issuance of the money starts at the top and trickles all the way down. But at every level in the process, there's leakage. There's loss of energy and loss of finance at every level of this process. So typically this is manifested as the banks print the money, the politicians and the banks are right up the top of this hierarchy, property speculators and stock market speculators are somewhere in the middle, and people like us are down the bottom. This is why a real estate agent in some of our countries makes more money than a surgeon. This is the reason. There is no other reason. They're not better qualified, they're not more valued in society, they are just closer to the money printer. And this is a very well understood phenomenon. This is a headline from my state earlier this year where hundreds of doctors walked off the job to try and get an increase in their salaries as part of bargaining negotiations. Our politicians never do that because they print money and they pay themselves. On a Bitcoin standard, this cannot happen because the issuance is middle out. There is no printer. We are the printer. We control the flow of the money and we determine the allocation. Now, it wouldn't be a tech talk without a little bit of AI. So just to wake everybody up again, I've put an AI slide in there. I asked SuperGrok to model what the payment is for a typical Australian politician versus a typical Australian health worker. So doctors, nurses, physios, things like that. It analyzed 20 years of public data, including all the contracts of doctors, nurses, and politicians over the last 20 years in South Australia. And this was the result. The average year-on-year increase without protesting was about 4% per year for a politician and about 3% per year for a doctor or a nurse. Now, this might not seem like a big difference, 1% per year, but it makes a massive difference over the career of a politician or the career of a doctor because of compounding interest. This is money that is going to politicians that the population does not want to go to politicians. They want this money to go towards treating patients, to treating themselves. The leak is real. The Cantillon effect is real, and it's important to understand it. This idea is pretty well understood by people in Bitcoin circles, many of whom are actively trying to sort of right the ship and move to a system that allocates value more fairly. And I think, it's time for us to engage with this, in my opinion. So how do we engage with this? I think most importantly is education. So try to understand what Bitcoin is, how it works. Is it real or not? Do you believe it might have value or not? And just spend some time reading about it from multiple sources. And if you believe that it has any value, and this is not financial advice, consider participating, not passively, but actively. Most importantly, hold it yourself. Don't leave it somewhere where it'll get lost or stolen. And don't worry about the price. This is a long-term strategy. We're very early in this technological journey. But if the dollar does get disrupted, and sooner or later it's going to be disrupted by something better, please do not be the last one left at the train station when the train leaves for good. It's inevitable that this will happen, and try and protect yourself. Now, I sense that many of you are still very skeptical because this is like kind of a novel concept. So I'm going to leave you with one final thought, and I'll try and tie it back to colorectal surgery, given we're at the colorectal conference. A right hemicolectomy in 1995, when I was 14 years old, was done via laparotomy, it was done open, and had 8 days in hospital, and it cost a measly $8,000 to do. Today, a right hemicolectomy, despite half the hospital stay, and these are meta-analysis numbers, I didn't just pull these out of thin air, costs $25,000 US. But you need to factor in inflation. $8,000 in 1995 is $31,000 today, and that's just using CPI, 3%, not 10%, okay? Our patients are doing better, and we are actually becoming much more cost efficient in real terms. And this means that we should not blame ourselves for these problems. We are the solution. We are not the problem. And in fact, despite all the political doom and gloom, there is much to be optimistic about. We have improved the quality and the efficiency of our surgery, and I think we're on the precipice of a new technological frontier, where technology not only advances healthcare delivery and surgery, but also advances the way in which it is valued and the way in which it is paid for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And